Hey, and welcome again to our weekly COVID-19 update. So today, Wednesday, 21st of July, things are really starting to look up. So let's go straight away to the data. Let's have a look where we are. In terms of the data. Right. Okay, here's where we are, and as you can see, this is our 7-day average, the daily number of cases worked out on a 7-day average, and you can see that we are starting to come down on our third wave. So it's starting to look like our second wave and our first wave, and this is really to a large extent. Well, let me first get to here. We actually did top our second wave, and you can see that the trajectory is now starting to look like the second wave. But I should mention that we are coming down. It is looking good. We are starting to look a little bit more optimistic, but we are still pretty much in the epidemic. We're still much in the thick of it. And you can see that we are higher, in fact, than the first wave. And this is largely driven by the fact that Gauteng has come down quite markedly. So that's really good news for Gauteng. There are differences between the different provinces, and I'll show you in the next couple of slides. This is the Western Cape. They are still going up, but maybe starting to plateau, a similar kind of pattern like we saw in the second wave when they get to their peak. So that's the Western Cape. The Eastern Cape, they're still probably in the early part of the third wave. They still have to come up a bit, but also they will probably start plateauing fairly soon. Unfortunately, KwaZulu-Natal, this coming down over here, this is really probably an artifact. I don't think we put too much. It's probably the unrest. There's a bit of deficiency in terms of notifying cases. So that's where we are in terms of the data. If we look at the Hatsola program, the home management program for patients with COVID, again, good news. If we look at the new cases, that's come down quite markedly, right down to 30 new cases yesterday. And also the active cases are also starting to come down. So all in all, good news. But however, remember, as I said in the first couple of slides, we are still very much in the thick of it. No time now to relax. And particularly individuals who have been vaccinated, you're not totally protected. You still need to take care of yourself, take all the precautions quite seriously. These are the hospital admissions coming from the NICD data. And again, also starting to level off. You can see it here on this line graph over here, starting to plateau. All right, now where are we with the vaccination? Well, it is certainly picking up steam. Yesterday, just over 200,000 vaccinations. Still a bit of way to go to the aim of getting to 300,000 daily vaccinations, and also supplemented by weekend vaccinations if we're going to reach the aim by the end of the year. So looking at this over here, you can see that the majority, in fact, come from the public sector. That's in grey. In fact, other provinces other than the Gauteng, the great majority are in the public sector. So the vaccination is ticking along, but again, still a ways to go. Total of 5.5 million vaccine doses have been administered so far. Actually, what's quite gratifying, we look at KwaZulu-Natal, despite the unrest, they're in fact the second highest vaccination of all the provinces. So it is quite gratifying. And the split between the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, just over 1 million Johnson & Johnson vaccines have been administered, just under 500,000 to the healthcare workers. Remember, that was the Sisonke trial. And just over 500,000 to the teachers, the police force, security personnel, and so on. And 4.5 million have been administered of Pfizer vaccines. 3.6 million people have had their first dose, and 870,000 of this 3.6 million, the second dose as well. So in terms of our vaccination status, we are behind. Of course, there's a long way to catch up still. We had a slow start, but the vaccination tempo is picking up. In fact, there's a graph, I didn't put it up today, showing that, in fact, in terms of speed, we're actually now about 11th or 12th in the world in terms of the speed of vaccination. But nevertheless, as I said, we still got a leeway to catch up in. So just to show you our status, 4.7% of the adult population have been fully vaccinated. In other words, either one dose of Johnson & Johnson or 2 doses of Pfizer. Partially vaccinated, in other words, 1 dose of Pfizer, that's 9.2% of the adult population. Just to show you where we were last week when I spoke to you, we were 3.6% of the adult population. So in a week, we caught up from 3.6 to 4.7% being totally vaccinated, and from 7.7% partially vaccinated to 9.2% today. All right, now I just want to answer some of the questions. A question which does keep cropping up. I did touch on it a little bit last week, but I do want to really emphasize it. I'm sorry about the detail of this. This is the best slide I could pick up just to illustrate what I was going to say. But you can just concentrate just on this area over here. What I want to talk about is isolation and quarantine, because there are a lot of questions which come up related to this. What do we mean by isolation? What do we mean by quarantine? Where are we in danger if you come into contact with somebody, or at risk, come into contact with somebody that either has tested positive or has got clinical symptoms? So if you look at this cartoon over here, the incubation period, okay, is a time for when the virus enters into the body, in other words, when you're exposed to the virus, to the time when you start getting symptoms or when you test positive, the symptomatic phase. And then after the symptomatic phase, you either are cured, you recover, or you, unfortunately, a few people will go into complications. A minority of people go into complications. So when are you at risk when you come into contact with an individual? You see this blue area over here represents where the virus is replicating. In other words, multiplying in the upper part of the respiratory tract, and the nose and the throat and the mouth and so on. And this is where if you come into contact with somebody, you can pick up the virus. So the first period I want to talk about is the isolation period. If somebody is infected and if somebody has got the illness, they are infectious from about 2 days before they start showing symptoms up till about 10 days afterwards. So that is why if somebody is ill, they should isolate. Otherwise, they should be separated from any other individuals for a period of up to 10 days after they start showing their symptoms. If you come into contact with somebody, okay, they can be infectious even before they show symptoms, from about 2 days before they start showing symptoms up to the 10 days of the isolation period. Now, if an individual comes into contact with somebody who is infectious, okay, they need to quarantine. That's the quarantine period. Now, the quarantine period is worked out on a separate thing. The quarantine period really correlates to the incubation time. In other words, if you come into contact with somebody, we want to observe you to see whether you are going to pick up the infection or not. And in that period of time, you also need to be separated from other people. You need to be quarantined or isolated from other people, just in case you are infected. And that period of time has been worked out to be 10 days. Now, I know the average is 5 days on this cartoon, but it can stretch up to 10 days. In fact, it can be longer, but we feel that the risk after 10 days is really vanishingly small. So the quarantine period, if you come into contact, is really to kind of separate you to see, are you going to pick up the infection or not? So many of these questions come in. How long do you have to quarantine for? Can you, when you come into contact with somebody, when is the risk factors? So it's 2 days before somebody that is infected, up to 10 days. The isolation period is 10 days. The quarantine period is 10 days, to make it simple. All right, so I want to now maybe just deal with some of the questions. And again, thank you very much, everybody, for sending in questions. I've got so many, it's going to be impossible to really go through them all. So I'm just going to take a handful. I've tried to kind of group them all together. There was one quite urgent question, which I'll just cover very quickly. If you do get side effects from the vaccine occasionally can give a tender arm, or the next day one can feel a little bit fluish or a bit out of sorts, muscle pains, like as if you've got flu, may even have a low-grade temperature. So it's perfectly acceptable to take an aspirin, to take paracetamol or Panado. That's really not going to affect the immune response to the vaccine. It won't make the vaccine any less effective. And certainly if you are troubled by these minor side effects, well, you may last a day or two, maybe 2 to 3 days, some people, you certainly can take an aspirin or a Panado just to treat those symptoms. Another very frequent question which does come up, and I know I did deal with it last week, but if you'll allow me just to kind of re-emphasize again, because these questions do keep coming up, and that is the spacing between the Pfizer vaccines, the first dose and the second dose. The optimal is the 42 days, the 6 weeks. The reason for that is that if you delay, you get a slightly better response than what was originally worked out in the trials of the 3 weeks. So although I know in the United States and in Israel and Europe, they they still stick to the original registered 3 weeks, which is registered with the FDA. But a number of countries, United Kingdom have actually stretched it out to 12 weeks, but we make it 6 weeks. But if you can't go at 6 weeks for your second dose, it doesn't really matter. You can go for a 7-week interval, or 8-week, or 9-week, or 10-week, even 12-week. 12 weeks is what they do in the United Kingdom, even longer than 12 weeks. In fact, a number of our vaccines, like the hepatitis vaccine, the papilloma vaccine, we wait 6 months. The only problem, of course, if you wait too long, then you're not going to be adequately protected in that period of time. One dose will give some degree of protection of the Pfizer vaccine, but certainly not as much as we'd like. And for that reason, it's probably better to try and stick as close as possible to the 6 weeks, not less than 6 weeks, but to the 6 weeks. But again, if you are delayed, it's not really going to make too much difference. And related to that, a related question, which also often comes up, is, do we need boosters? And no, not as yet. The 2 doses will give you an optimal immune response, and at this stage, you don't need something to augment that. And in fact, a booster is not going to make it any stronger than that. So there's no point. We may well need to have boosters in a year's time, or maybe sometime next year, but certainly not for this year. And the same would apply to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. You're going to get optimal an immune response, and there's no point in having a booster at this stage. We may require boosters at a later stage, maybe towards the end of the year or next year, but certainly not now. A booster is not going to augment it even further. And if one has had COVID, you should have a vaccine. In other words, if you have the illness itself, you should have a vaccine. But try and wait at least 4 weeks after recovery before you have the vaccine. That's really to kind of minimize any of the side effects from the vaccine. I'm going to leave it there, and thank you. And I'll try and get to a lot more questions maybe next week. We'll see you next week for the next COVID-19 update. So thank you very much for listening. Have a good day. Bye-bye.